Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now, let's get into tonight's stories. I hadn't been back to my parents' house in over a decade. They both passed away within 6 months of each other. My mum from a stroke in early February, and my dad from pancreatic cancer that had eaten him alive by August. They weren't especially old, just unlucky. I suppose I'd always expected that house to outlive them. It sat in the woods just outside of Elk Bend, Maine, about a 10-minute drive from any working cell tower, nestled in the kind of rural silence that city people romanticize until they actually experience it. I returned because someone had to clean it out before the bank sold it. My older sister, Janice, wanted nothing to do with it. Burn it down for all I care, she told me over the phone. That place gave me nightmares. She wasn't being dramatic. We both had our ghosts from that place, but for some reason, I'd always carried mine quieter. I don't know why I volunteered to do it. Maybe I thought it would be therapeutic. Maybe I wanted closure. It was the first week of October when I pulled into the gravel driveway. The trees were already shedding, dumping dry leaves across the yard and roof in golds and reds and brittle browns. The gutters sagged with wet muck. The windows were fogged over. The front steps groaned like they recognized me. Walking through that door was like stepping into a sealed memory. The air had that old wood mustiness, mixed with something more sour, like mold in the walls. The furniture was covered in yellowed sheets. The framed family photos along the staircase were still in place, as if someone had posed them just last week. I passed my old 3rd grade class photo on the way up, the one where I had a black eye because I walked into a mailbox during recess. Even the mail key was still in the ceramic dish by the door. The plan was to work room by room, box what could be salvaged, and dump the rest. But I never made it past the attic. I wasn't looking for anything specific when I opened the hatch and pulled down the ladder. The attic had always creeped me out as a kid. Low ceilings, insulation sticking out like pink cotton tumors, and that one single light bulb with the chain you had to pull. But I was older now, logical, practical, or at least I thought I was. The first thing that hit me when I climbed up was the smell. Not rot, exactly, just age. The air was dry and full of dust, and it scratched the back of my throat as I moved through boxes labeled XMAS 1998 and Books Dad. Spiderwebs hung like thin silk curtains, catching the beam of my flashlight. It took me a while to find the box. It was shoved behind an old rolled-up rug and a broken fan. It was labeled Nati 2004. I froze. I would have been 11. The handwriting was mine, though rough and uneven, the way kids write when they're just starting to mimic cursive. The box itself was small, just a little filing box with a plastic latch. Inside were things I vaguely remembered: a Power Rangers figure, a couple Goosebumps books, a handful of Pokemon cards, and a drawing I must have made of our dog Buddy, who had 3 legs. But I gave him 4 in the picture because I thought he'd appreciate that. And underneath it all, there was a journal. It wasn't a school notebook. It was a real journal, leather-bound, with a little buckle strap to keep it shut. The cover had a worn symbol carved into it, like a circle with a line through it, though it might have just been a scribble. My name was written on the inside cover. Full name, neat lettering. Nathaniel Mercedart. I sat down cross-legged on the attic floor and opened it. The first few pages were innocent enough. Doodles. Lists of my favorite dinosaurs. A log of all the bugs I'd caught that summer, complete with an ant body count. But as I flipped further, things changed. The tone of the writing shifted. The childish spelling was still there, but the words didn't match the innocence. There were entries with dates, names, descriptions of people I didn't recognize, and then this one, November 6th, 2004. The girl in the red jacket, I saw her again tonight in the woods. She was crying. She couldn't scream because her mouth was full of leaves. He pushed her face into the mud and her shoes came off. One went in the river. I don't think she had a name. Maybe she did before, but he took it. He always takes the name first. I tried to tell Dad, but he didn't hear me. I wrote it down instead. Mr. Kind said she would die when the moon was big. He was right again. My throat went dry. I stared at the page for a long time, trying to piece together what I was even looking at. It had the feel of a ghost story or a nightmare scribbled after waking up, but it didn't feel like me. I didn't remember writing this. Not a single word. Who was Mr. Kind? Why was this so detailed? Why would I, an 11-year-old, write something like this? Maybe it was a story I made up. That's what I told myself. I was always a creative kid. Maybe I wrote stories and forgot about them. Maybe I was just a messed up little boy looking for attention. But there were more, dozens more. Each entry was about a different person. Most were just titles, written like chapter headings. Some had dates, some had full paragraphs. A few had crude maps, stick figures and houses, rivers, trails in the woods. Some had red ink smears across the bottom. Others had that same repeating phrase over and over again. I watched it happen. I couldn't stop it. I wish I could say I stopped reading there. I wish I had closed the journal, packed the box, and walked away. But I didn't, because something in my gut told me this wasn't just a forgotten story or a child's fantasy. Something deep inside me, something that hadn't woken up in years, told me that this was real. And the worst part, that first entry, the one about the girl in the red jacket, had a full name listed beneath it. Melissa Keegan. I recognized it immediately. Not because she was someone I knew growing up, but because I'd read her name before in the paper, in the obituaries, in a missing persons report dated 2004, the same week as the journal entry. The same girl, same name, same red jacket, and she had been found in 2007, dead, buried, in a shallow grave less than 2 miles from our house. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, at least. Not in the way I'd been scared as a kid. There were no creaking floorboards, no flickering lights or slamming doors. No, this was a different kind of fear. Something slow and internal, like acid quietly dissolving something important inside you. The kind of fear that didn't make you scream. It just kept you very, very still. I stayed at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, flipping through pages with stiff fingers. A steaming mug of black coffee sat untouched beside me. I must have reread that first entry 10 times. She couldn't scream because her mouth was full of leaves. It echoed in my head. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence. A dark, unnerving coincidence. I'd written a story as a kid and unknowingly used a real name. That happened all the time, right? A kid has an overactive imagination, writes about someone dying in the woods, and then years later, someone with that name actually goes missing, right? Except I knew I was lying to myself. The details were too specific. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for everything I could find on Melissa Keegan. It wasn't much. Small town, local paper, the Elk Bend Gazette. A few sparse archives still available online, though most of it was scanned PDFs with terrible formatting. But the basics were all there. Melissa had been 11 years old. She went missing on November 6, 2004, a Saturday. She was last seen riding her bike down Hartley Creek Trail, wearing a red jacket and pink boots. The trail was less than a mile from my childhood home. The journal described her jacket, the trail, the river, even the part about her shoes being lost in the water. All of it. Her remains were discovered in 2007, when a hunter's dog started digging near a shallow creek bank about a quarter-mile off the main trail. The police never officially ruled it a homicide. They didn't have enough forensic evidence, but unofficially, everyone in town believed it. There were rumors, lots of them. Some said it was a drifter. Others blamed a known sex offender who had lived nearby at the time, but nothing ever stuck. Her file was cold. The journal had written it down 3 years before they found the body. I stared at my name on the inside cover of the journal, Nathaniel Mercer, age 11. I tried to remember myself at that age. I couldn't, not really, not clearly. It was like trying to remember someone else's dreams. I could recall fragments riding bikes with Janice, sitting in the backyard counting lightning, bugs, the smell of burnt toast. But my actual thoughts back then, gone, maybe blocked, maybe just faded. I went back to the journal. There were more entries, not about Melissa, but about other people, other names, each with its own heading, like a title in a horror anthology. Some were single lines, others went on for pages. I found one called March 14th, 2005, The Lake House Couple. It read, "They didn't see him watching. The glass door makes it easy to hide in the dark. She screamed first. He didn't say anything. The boat drifted all night with the motor running, making circles in the water. In the morning, only her hand was still floating. Mr. Kind said they had to die together, like a story with no ending." Who the hell was Mr. Kind? That name was popping up again and again, in different entries, always in some cryptic offhand way. Mr. Kind told me, or Mr. Kind was right, or he says I have to write it all down. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes until colors swirled behind my lids. Maybe this was all just the ramblings of a disturbed kid, but the fact that the first entry matched a real crime scene made me feel like I'd stumbled onto something far worse than forgotten fiction. I searched Lake House Murders, Maine, 2005, and after a few dead ends, I found it, an article. From the Bangor Courier, March 2005, Caleb Miller and Brianna Holt, both 19, went missing after spending the weekend at Caleb's family's lake cabin near Moose Point, about 40 minutes from Elk Bend. Their boat was found adrift on the lake, motor still running, with no one inside. Her body washed up days later. His was never recovered. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but again, no one could explain why they were in the water in the first place. The family insisted both were experienced swimmers. There were rumors of foul play, but the case, just like Melissa's, was quietly closed. Another cold file in a small town with limited resources. I compared it to the journal entry again. In the morning, only her hand was still floating. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. I hadn't even lived in Elk Bend during that time. Our family was in Portland for most of March. I only moved back for a short time the following summer, and I hadn't heard anything about that lake house story until now. So why would I have written about it? I checked the date of the journal entry again. March 14th, 2005. The exact date of the couple's disappearance. Not after. Not even the day after. That day, I ran my fingers down the page. The handwriting was juvenile, unsteady, but unmistakably mine. There was a smudge of something brown along the edge of the page. Old dirt, maybe, or dried blood. No, that was ridiculous. I closed the book and stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a scrape. The kitchen light flickered overhead. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. Just the house settling, I told myself. Just old wiring. Just coincidence. The journal sat on the table like something that had followed me home. Like it had waited for years in that attic box, waiting for me to find it. And now that I had, it wasn't letting go. I don't know why I didn't throw it out right then and there. I don't know why I didn't burn the damn thing. But something in me, call it curiosity, call it guilt, whispered, keep reading, because if 2 of those entries were real, how many others were? And what if some of them hadn't happened yet? The journal stayed on the kitchen table for 2 days. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. I didn't even walk past it unless I absolutely had to. It just sat there, waiting, like something feral, pretending to sleep. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I swore I could hear the cover creak open on its own. I told myself that was ridiculous, but I still left the hallway light on at night, just in case. I wasn't sleeping well. My dreams were scattered, twitchy things, flashes of faces I didn't know, names I'd never heard, screaming muffled by water or dirt. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping, certain someone had been whispering in my ear. But every time, the house was empty, dead quiet. On the 3rd morning, I snapped. I sat back down at the kitchen table, opened the journal, and started reading through the entries, one by one. I told myself I wasn't afraid anymore, that I was in control, that this was just some freak childhood phase. I didn't remember some preteen version of therapy through creative writing. But the deeper I went, the less that theory held water. Entry after entry described violent, specific, and eerily realistic deaths. He bled into the cornfield for hours. Nobody heard him. She was buried standing up. The roots kept growing through her ribs. He told her the camera was off, but it wasn't. I tried to remember myself as a kid. Sure. I was a little strange, quiet, maybe too quiet. I'd had some behavioral issues at school, nothing serious, but enough that my parents made me see a therapist for a while. But I was never violent. I never hurt animals. I didn't wet the bed or light fires or draw dead people in crayon. Or at least, that's what I thought. But the journal didn't read like fiction. It didn't feel like a kid playing make-believe. It felt documented, like I'd been recording something, watching something. There was one phrase that kept repeating across different entries, scrawled in the margins, sometimes backward, sometimes in red ink. I watched it happen. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop it. That part rattled me. Like I was confessing to something I couldn't control. Not doing it, not killing anyone, but witnessing it. Seeing it in some dark, impossible way. Like a bystander to something monstrous. Like a mirror with no reflection. I flipped to the middle of the journal and found an entry with no title, no date. Just a block of text and a sketch in the bottom corner. The text read, "He stands by the foot of my bed. Every night he tells me names and numbers. He says if I don't write them, he'll tell them to someone else instead. Someone worse. He has too many teeth. His voice sounds like chewing glass underwater. Beneath that, the drawing dot it was crude. Obviously drawn by a child, but there was something horrifying about its simplicity. A stick figure in bed. Another, taller figure standing beside it. Long fingers reaching down. Where the face should have been was a blank oval, just scribbled over in thick, dark pencil. No eyes, no mouth. Just a smudge of something empty. Below the sketch, I had written in shaky letters, Mr. Kind. That name again. He kept appearing, not as the killer exactly, but as some kind of presence. An observer, a messenger, a whisperer. It made my skin crawl. And the more I saw his name, the more I felt something bubbling up from inside me, like I did remember him, but not in words, not in images, in feeling, like a smell you haven't encountered in years that suddenly takes you back to a forgotten room. I closed the journal and paced the room. I was losing my grip. This wasn't just about a creepy diary anymore. It was messing with my head, making me question my memories, my sanity. Was it possible I had some kind of childhood condition? Sleepwalking, maybe? Dissociation, could I have? Imagined these things and just convinced myself they were real. I decided to check something. I pulled out an old filing box, labeled Medical Nate, full of pediatric records, dentist forms, school notes. I found a yellowing file tucked in the back. My psychological evaluations from age 9 through 12. Notes from a Dr. Byron Fletcher, a child psychiatrist my parents sent me to after what they called the bathroom incident. No explanation of what that was. One excerpt stood out. Patient displays dissociative symptoms and describes recurring dreams involving a tall, faceless man he calls Mr. Kind. Drawings indicate possible night terrors and auditory hallucinations. Patient is reluctant to speak in sessions and often stares at the ceiling as if watching something. Recommending sleep study. I flipped the page with trembling fingers. In week 4, patient spoke aloud for the first time during sleep observation. He muttered a list of names and numbers. One of the names, Melissa K., later matched a missing person case in a nearby county. Parents claim it's a coincidence. Patient does not recall saying it. My stomach dropped. There it was, on paper. Years before Melissa Keegan was even found, her name had already been on my lips, while I was asleep, whispered in some subconscious state. And somehow I wrote it down. I sat back in the chair, cold sweat clinging to the back of my neck. The room felt darker than it had 5 minutes ago. Or maybe I'd just become more aware of the shadows in it. This wasn't a creative writing journal. This wasn't fiction. It was a record, and whoever or whatever had been giving me the information wasn't me. There's a strange moment that happens when reality starts to shift. Not all at once, but slowly in pieces. For me, it began with the sound of my own name in a context I didn't remember saying it. Then it was the mention of real-world crimes I shouldn't have known anything about. Now it was full immersion. I wasn't reading a creepy childhood journal anymore. I was investigating it. I had crossed some invisible line and going back, pretending this was just a childhood phase or fantasy wasn't an option anymore. So I leaned into it. I reopened the entry titled March 14th, 2005, The Lake House Couple. I'd skimmed it before, but this time I read every line slowly. They laughed too loud when they thought they were alone. He watched them from the trees, behind the sliding glass door. He waited until the girl fell asleep on the couch. Then he went in through the water, quiet like a fish. She screamed first, but he didn't like that. He made her quiet. Then he made him watch. The boat floated for hours. It spun in circles, the light still on, until the moon went away. In the morning, only her hand was left floating. Mr. Kine said they were guilty, that love is a disease, that they wanted to be punished. March 14th, 2005. The writing still had that weird blend of childlike observation and poetic brutality, like a diary entry filtered through something inhuman, something that understood death more intimately than any 11-year-old should. The drawing below, it was simple. A cabin, a lake, a boat drifting away in the dark. 2 stick figures, one floating, one with a red X over the head. I knew this wasn't just a story. I had found the article already, but now I reread it with fresh eyes. Caleb Miller and Brianna Holt, 19 years old, local community college students. They'd borrowed Caleb's dad's cabin for the weekend, a modest tour room place out on Moose Point Lake, 40 minutes from where I grew up. They were reported missing on March 14th, 2005, after neither showed up for class or answered calls. Their canoe was found drifting across the lake with a flashlight still on inside. 4 days later, Brianna's body was recovered about 2 miles downriver. Cause of death, presumed drowning. Caleb's body was never found. Reading the news coverage, I noticed something I hadn't before. The article mentioned a fisherman's statement. He said he'd seen the canoe circling slowly in the water around 4 a.m., but assumed someone had just tied it and left it adrift. The time matched the journal's vague reference to the moon. Going away, I felt sick. The journal entry had included a strange line that seemed like nonsense at first. He went in through the water, quiet like a fish. But now, I wondered if that meant the killer had swum to the cabin, avoided the roads, snuck in through the lake itself. That detail wasn't in any of the articles. It wasn't in the police reports either, I checked. But it fit. And that meant one of 2 things. Either I was the most disturbingly imaginative kid on earth, or I knew something I wasn't supposed to know, that I had no right to know. I went outside for air. The Maine woods were dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the occasional crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The sun was setting, casting the trees in gold and red. I stood out on the back porch, hands on the railing, trying to calm myself. Then I saw it down at the tree line. Just where the woods began, there was a small depression in the ground, a ring of disturbed earth, maybe an old fire pit. A storm had knocked down some branches there, and the leaves had scattered in an odd spiral. I stared at it for a long time, heart beginning to race, because I remembered drawing that shape. That spiral it was in one of the later journal entries. I hadn't gotten to it yet, but the image had lodged in my brain when I first skimmed it. A wide spiral made of leaves, like a ritual circle, like something waiting. I went back inside and flipped through the journal, page by page, until I found it. He left the spiral so they would know it was his. The leaves turn clockwise. That's how you know he's coming back. The wind doesn't move them. He moves them, one by one. He always comes back. Below that, a crude map of my own backyard. The exact angle from the back porch, the same tree line, the same ring of leaves dated. October 10th, 2005. That was today's date. But 20 years ago, I slammed the journal shut. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't coincidence. That was a journal entry describing something that existed right now, outside, in the backyard, and somehow, impossibly, it had been written. 2 decades ago, I didn't sleep that night either. I turned on every light in the house, locked all the doors and windows, and sat up in the living room with the journal on the coffee table and a fire poker clenched in both hands, like a weapon. Nothing happened, no sounds, no voices, but I had the dream again. I was underwater, but I could breathe. The water wasn't clear. It was thick, like ink. I could see a shape floating near me, a human figure with arms stretched out wide, drifting in slow motion. I swam closer and saw the figure was me, not drowning, just watching behind me. A ripple in the black. A tall shape moved through the ink, eyes glowing faintly white dot. Mr. Kind, I woke up with blood on my lip from biting it in my sleep. The journal was still there, closed, sitting on the table. I knew what I had to do next. If the journal was real, if it was telling the truth, then somebody else had to know. I just needed to figure out how to ask without sounding completely insane. When I was 8 years old, I used to talk to someone in my sleep. That's not just family folklore. It's in my old psychiatric reports. My dad used to call it your nightly sermons. He'd joke that I should charge admission, but sometimes I'd wake up to find my parents staring at me from the bedroom doorway, pale and silent. And on those mornings, they wouldn't laugh. My mum once told my aunt that my bedroom got cold when I talked like that, colder than the rest of the house. I hadn't thought about any of that in years, until now, because the journal, the one I found in the attic, didn't just describe crimes, it described conversations, and those conversations were always with the same figure. He was never called by his real name, assuming he had one, but always by a title I'd apparently given him as a child. Mr. Kind, at first. The entries where he appeared were rare, but after reading deeper into the journal, I noticed a pattern. Starting around mid-2004, he showed up more frequently, then almost constantly. His presence spread like mold through the pages. Casual at first, then increasingly dominant. Here's one entry I can't forget. He came again tonight. Mr. Kind. He stands at the corner and waits until I stop breathing hard. Then he sits at the foot of my bed like a cat. His legs bend wrong. He hums backwards. He told me the next name. She's already in the woods. I asked if she could be saved. He said, "You're not here to stop them. You're here to remember." Then there were others like it. Conversations that read more like dictation than diary entries. Descriptions of nighttime visits. Dreams that felt real. Instructions or predictions, depending on how you looked at them. Each time, Mr. Kind whispered a name, a date, a method. I would write it down, and then weeks, months, or even years later, a real person matching that name would show up in a missing persons archive. Sometimes found, sometimes never. The scariest part wasn't that I knew these things. It was that I seemed okay with it at the time. I wasn't afraid in those entries. I didn't sound panicked. I sounded obedient. Like I understood that Mr. Kind was just part of my reality. Maybe that's the worst part of childhood. You accept the monsters if they show up early enough. If they show up every night, they stop being monsters. They become routine. I found one. Entry that chilled me more than any crime scene description. Mr. Kind told me I'm the jar, that he puts the memories in me so someone remembers when the world forgets. He said if I don't write them, they disappear for good. He said forgetting is how evil wins. The jar. That word stuck with me. I wasn't the killer. I wasn't even the witness. I was just the jar the thing being used to collect and preserve the events. Like I was some kind of psychic hard drive for atrocity. And somehow, at 11 years old, I knew that. I understood it. I remembered that phrase from the psychiatric report. Patient often stares at the ceiling as if watching something. Now I wondered if I was listening. Maybe the whole time I'd just been writing things that didn't come from me. I dug through another old attic box marked electronics, MISC, hoping to find anything from my childhood that could shed more light. And that's when I found it. An old black MP3 recorder, the kind with the tiny screen and rubber buttons. It barely held an hour of audio. My parents had given it to me during the time I saw Dr. Fletcher, probably hoping I'd use it to record stories or thoughts. Instead, I'd used it to record my sleep. The battery was dead, of course, but I had a charger. When I plugged it in, the screen flickered, then lit up to saved recordings, both labeled the same way: Nate_night_1, Nate_night_2. I braced myself and hit play on the first one. At first, all I could hear was the rustle of sheets, breathing. Nothing strange then. Around the 7-minute mark, the voice started. It was my voice, younger, thinner, whispering. ... 2. In the woods, blood on the back seat, a long pause. ... Melissa, red jacket, Hartley Trail. Another pause, then something fainter, garbled deeper than my voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it had rhythm, like a song made of smoke and broken teeth. I couldn't tell if it was on the recording or in the room. I hit pause and just sat there, heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't just imagination. I had recorded myself whispering these names in my sleep, verbatim, names I shouldn't have known. I played the second file. This one started with silence again. Then my voice, louder this time. March 14th, Circle Lake, hands in the water. And then, clear as day, Mr. Kind says there next. The couple in the glass house. They don't hear the water. The recording ended abruptly. No static, no distortion, just silence. I stared at the screen until it dimmed and shut off. I knew what I had to do next. I had to find out if anyone else remembered. Mr. Kind, not the name. No one else would know that. But the idea, the figure, maybe someone else had dreams like mine. Maybe someone else had seen what I saw. I didn't know what I expected. But the moment I typed "tall man no face whispering dreams" into the search bar, I was flooded with results, forums, subreddits, paranormal blogs, all using different names: the Pale Watcher, the Whisperman, the Listener. But the descriptions were the same: faceless, long limbs, appears at night, speaks in riddles, gives people visions, tells secrets. But the most terrifying thread was one I found on a dead message board from 2009. Just one post. It was titled, "Mr. Kind Came Back." There was no reply, no follow-up, no explanation, just one sentence, in all caps. "If you found the journal, he's already inside you." I didn't want to go to the police. I mean, how do you even start that conversation? "Hi, yes, I found a childhood journal in my dead parents' attic. It predicts multiple real-life murders in disturbingly accurate detail, some of which hadn't even happened at the time of writing. Oh, and I think a faceless dream entity gave me the information." Yeah, that would go over great. But still, I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just about my own sanity, or lack of it. The journal wasn't just a relic from some disturbed phase of my youth. It was a catalogue, a record of crimes that no one had connected, at least not yet. I decided I wouldn't tell them. Everything just enough. So I called the local precinct in Elk Bend, introduced myself as Nathan Mercer, and asked casually if I could speak to someone familiar with older missing persons cases. The woman who answered said, "Hold on, honey," and left me on hold for nearly 5 minutes. When she came back, she gave me the name of a retired detective, Eli Garrison. "He was on the Keegan case," she said. "He doesn't work here anymore, but he still lives out near Moose Point. Real friendly. You can probably find him listed." And I did. 3 days later, I was knocking on his screen door. Detective Eli Garrison was about what you'd expect from a man who'd worked Maine law enforcement for 4 decades. Thick mustache, sun-damaged skin, and eyes that told you he'd seen too much and wasn't done seeing it. His house was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of tobacco and wood polish. He invited me in, offered me coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table, which, eerily, looked almost exactly like the one back in my parents' house. I started carefully, told him I was researching old local cases, that I'd grown up in Elk Bend and remembered some of the missing person stories from back then. Said I wanted to write a book, true crime, fictionalized for privacy. He chuckled and said, "Everyone wants to write about Melissa Keegan. Poor girl became our town's ghost story." I leaned in. Did anything ever come of that? Any real suspects? He looked at me, squinting. "No," he said. "No one we could pin. We had our theories, sure. Lot of people thought it was that guy Dunning who used to live up near Hartley Trail, but nothing stuck. No DNA, no prints, nothing. Just the girl, buried shallow. Like whoever did it wanted her found, eventually." I took a deep breath. "What about the lake house couple?" He raised an eyebrow. "You remember that too, huh?" "I remember reading about it." He nodded slowly. "That one still bugs me. Brianna washed up with blunt trauma to the head. Caleb never turned up, and their boat still had gas in it. Flashlight was on. No signs of robbery. Just ... gone. Like they were plucked out of the world." I paused, then asked what I really came to ask. Did either case have weird elements? Something that didn't make the reports? He gave me a long, appraising look. Then he sipped his coffee and leaned back. "Melissa had leaves in her mouth," he said. "Crammed in there, deep. Forensics thought it might have happened before she died, but they couldn't prove it. Too much decomposition." I felt my stomach twist. "And Brianna," he continued, "her hands were bent backward, like whoever killed her broke her fingers on purpose. Almost like a message, but no one ever figured out what it meant." I nodded slowly. I didn't want to, but I pulled out the photocopies I'd made from the journal. Not the whole book, just the entries. For Melissa and the lake house couple. I slid them across the table toward him. He read the first one in silence, then the second. When he finally looked up at me, the blood had drained from his face. "You wrote these?" he asked. I swallowed when I was 11. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "That's not possible." "I know." He stood up and walked to the window, looked out into the trees for a while. Then he said something I wasn't ready for. "We had another case," he said. "One that never made the papers." He turned back around, slow, late. 2005. A boy found in the woods near Sunderland Quarry. No ID. Estimated age, maybe 15. His body was covered in small, circular cuts, like someone used a hole punch on his skin. Most people thought it was animal damage, but the autopsy showed the wounds were made after death. Very precise. My hands were trembling now. Why wasn't it reported? I asked. Because he had something carved into his chest. Letters. What did they say? He walked to a drawer, opened it, and pulled out an old manila folder with the words, "Do not file," stamped across the top in red ink. He slid out a single photo and laid it on the table. I didn't want to look, but I did. There, carved into the pale, lifeless chest of a teenage boy, were the words, "The jar remembers." My heart almost stopped. Detective Garrison sat back down slowly. "You know what that means?" I nodded, barely. "I think I do." I left Detective Garrison's house in a daze. The whole drive home, I kept hearing that phrase echo inside my skull like a broken radio. The jar remembers. It wasn't just a creepy line from a journal. It was carved into the body of a real, unidentified boy. A detail buried so deep in local law enforcement files, not even the public had ever known about it. But I'd written those words when I was 11. I was beginning to accept something I didn't want to. This wasn't just a journal of imagined events. This was a record of real crimes, and I had somehow become their archivist. Not the killer, not the accomplice, but something else entirely. A jar. But what did that mean, and why me? I returned to my parents' house, the journal tucked under, my arm like contraband. I hadn't told Garrison the full truth. Not about the attic. Not about Mr. Kind. I didn't know if I ever would. He was already on edge, just reading the entries. If he knew about the dreams, the whispering, the ring of leaves in my backyard that matched a drawing from 2 decades ago, he'd think I needed a padded room, not a detective. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized maybe I wasn't the only jar. Maybe there were more. I spent the rest of the night combing through the journal, looking for clues. And that's when I noticed something strange. Every 15 to 20 entries or so, there'd be a line, sometimes hidden in the margins, sometimes in between thoughts that didn't match the others. Like it wasn't written by me, no. Childish handwriting, no observational tone, just cold, measured lines, almost like instructions. Jar 3, November complete. Jar 2, unstable observation, halted. Jar 1, failed to retain. ENTRY, decommission initiated. At first, I didn't understand. Then it hit me. Those weren't entries. They were logs. And the numbers. The jars, they weren't objects. They were people. Mr. Kind wasn't just a dream figure or some imaginary friend conjured up in a traumatized brain. He was something else, something organized, clinical, purposeful, and he had others like me. Other jars, other vessels for memory. Record keepers of pain. I flipped back through the entries and looked again at the language. I had ignored the first time. Jar 4 received the whisper before the frost. Jar 2 wouldn't stop bleeding. He asked for the names to stop. Jar 5 failed the December test. Replaced with glass. What the hell was I part of? Some kind of system, some network of human recorders for suffering. I thought back to the boy Detective Garrison mentioned, the one with the carvings. What if he had been a jar too? What if he'd failed, and this was his punishment? I knew what I had to do. I opened the journal and flipped to the very last entry. The last page was mostly blank, just one line, written in thick black ink. It said, Jar 6, primary record, concludes November 1st. That was 2 weeks from now. I stared at the date. A sick heat bloomed in my gut. Was that a warning? An end date? I had no idea what would happen on November 1st. I didn't know if I'd stop writing, or disappear, or wind up like that boy in the woods with words carved into my chest. But something was coming, and whatever it was, Mr. Kind already knew. That night, I had the worst dream I've had in years. It started like the others. The dark water, the floating figure, me watching. But this time, something changed. This time, I sank down into the ink. Past faces and bones and jars, real glass jars, full of fingers, teeth, names written on slips of paper and stuffed inside like pickled memories. Then I hit the floor of that bottomless dream lake, and there he was, Mr. Kind, tall, faceless, skin stretched thin over bones like wet parchment. No eyes, no mouth, but I could feel him smiling. He reached out, his fingers brushing my face. Then he whispered into my ear, "You were the best jar, but even jars crack." I woke up choking on nothing. Air wouldn't come. My throat was locked. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, awake in a body that wouldn't listen. Then I saw it, the journal, sitting on my desk, open to a page I hadn't seen before. My name was written on it, over and over again. Nathaniel Mercer Hases. Jar 6. Jar 6. Termination ready. Termination ready. Finally gasped and broke the paralysis. Threw myself out of bed. The journal snapped shut on its own, just slammed closed, like it had been caught doing something. The next morning, I found something that pushed everything over the edge. A box. Delivered to the porch. No return address. Inside it. 3 things. A cassette tape labeled Garrison -1996. A photograph of me as a child, sitting on the porch steps, asleep, taken from a distance. A handwritten note that said, "You're not the first jar to wake up, but you'll be the last to remember." I must have stared at that box for an hour. The photo alone nearly sent me over the edge. It was me, unmistakably, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the porch steps of our old house, eyes closed, head slumped to the side like I was asleep. My hands were folded in my lap, but something about my posture, it wasn't natural. I looked posed, delicately placed, like a corpse at a viewing. The angle of the photo told me something else. It was taken from the woods. Far back, whoever took it had been standing behind the tree line, the very spot where that spiral of leaves had appeared a few days ago, and the time stamp on the back. October 10th, 2005. The same date as the spiral. The same date mentioned in the journal entry, written years before today. That wasn't coincidence. That was proof. Proof someone, something, had been watching me my whole life. That this force, this Mr. Kind, or whatever he really was, had been orchestrating all of this for decades. And then there was the cassette. I held it like it might explode in my hand. Old school, thick plastic, the label written in blocky Sharpie. Garrison 1996. I didn't have a tape deck in the house, but I remembered there was one in the basement, part of an old stereo system my dad refused to throw out. I hadn't touched it in years, but I went down there with the tape and dusted off the deck like it was some ancient artifact. Plugged it in, the lights flickered, the machine WHINED. Then I pressed play. The tape clicked. At first it was just static, A few seconds of hiss and hum, then a voice, gravelly, familiar. Detective Eli Garrison. This is Detective Eli Garrison. Elk Bend PD recording is dated September 3rd, 1996. Interview subject, minor. Name withheld, male, approximately 12 years old. Found wandering Route 7 in underwear, barefoot, covered in pine sap. Initial report says he claimed to be escaping. The voice in the trees. Pause, the boy won't speak now. He's scribbling in a notebook. Dozens of pages, all in different handwriting. I've reviewed some of the pages. The content is disturbing. Another pause, a nervous breath. The child refers repeatedly to a figure called Mr. Kind. Same name we've heard in the other files. This makes 4 cases with that name mentioned. My blood turned to ice. 4 cases, so there were more of us, more jars. The recording went on. Some of the entries match missing persons reports from nearby counties before the dates those people went missing. In one case, the journal described a woman in a red scarf buried behind an abandoned barn near Sunderland Quarry. We checked, she was there. Body was badly decomposed, but the scarf matched the one in the photo on her missing poster, and the entry was dated for months prior. I staggered back from the stereo. My head spun. Nausea crept in like rising water. There was a network. They knew. The police, at least some of them, knew this was real. Knew that someone, or something, was using children to channel impossible knowledge. And instead of exposing it, they hid it. The recording continued. My gut says this isn't psychic. It's not schizophrenia either. It's something else. Something older, like these kids are antennas tuned to a frequency no one else can hear. Or worse, maybe they're not hearing it. Maybe they're being used, spoken through, like recorders, like jars. There it was again. That word. I fell to my knees on the basement floor. This wasn't a haunting. This was a process, a system. I wasn't cursed. I was commissioned. From the start, from childhood, marked, used. The tape's tone shifted near the end. Garrison sounded shaken. His voice dropped. The boy scratched something into the wall of the holding cell. I didn't see it until after they moved him to the facility. It said, "When jar 6 opens, the story ends." I don't know what that means, but I think I'm looking at the last chapter. Click dot, the tape ended. I sat there for a long time, in silence, trying not to breathe too loud, trying not to think too loud, because suddenly I was terrified that something might be listening back. That phrase he read from the wall, "When jar 6 opens, the story ends." I was jar 6, and I had just opened. I went back upstairs, the tape still clutched in my fist. My hands were trembling so hard, I nearly dropped it on the floor. I took one more look at the photo, the one of me sleeping on the porch. Then I flipped it over. Something else had been written on the back in pencil. I hadn't noticed before. A single sentence, faded and crooked. "You were the last memory before the forgetting." I felt something cold settle behind me. Not air, not temperature, a presence. I didn't turn around because I knew exactly who was standing there. I didn't turn around. Not at first. I stood there in the living room, the cassette tape still in my hand, staring at the back of that photo. You are the last memory before the forgetting. And I could feel him, behind me, not breathing, not shifting weight like a person, just there, fixed in place, like a shadow burned into the wall of reality. He didn't speak right away. There was no classic horror movie scare. No sudden roar, no claws on my shoulders. Just the quiet. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It wasn't a sound so much as a pressure in the air, a bending of the atmosphere around me. And then I heard his voice, but not out loud, inside my head. Turn around, little jar. It wasn't a threat, not a demand, not even cruel. It was tender, almost parental. Like he was proud. I turned, slowly. There was nothing behind me. First. Then I saw him, not with my eyes, but through them. Like a double exposure, bleeding into the corners of my vision. He stood against the far wall, impossibly tall, shoulders curved upward like mantis limbs, fingers that trailed down past his knees, ending in tips that shimmered and bent light like the surface of oil dot. And his face. No face, not blank, just absent, like looking at a tear in a photograph, a hole where something used to be. And when he spoke again, I didn't hear it in English. I didn't hear it at all. I understood it, like remembering a dream I never had. You've opened jar 6. You've remembered. That's what you're for. Not to change, not to stop, just to carry the record. My throat was dry. I didn't try to speak. I knew he'd hear me anyway. Why? I thought, why me? Why any of us? Because forgetting is the greatest sin. You are the last memory before the world empties itself. Empties. When memory dies, what follows becomes fiction. And fiction cannot suffer consequences. You exist to witness. He stepped forward, but the floor didn't creak. His form didn't displace space. It merely slipped across it like a second thought, like gravity bending around a void. Long ago, there were more. Many more. Jars across time, cultures, civilizations. They remembered names no one dared speak, histories too terrible for books. But over time, the vessels shattered. One by one, you are the last. I felt my knees give, but I didn't fall. Couldn't. My body wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the memory now. To him, what happens November 1st? The record concludes. Do I die? No. A pause. You become permanent. He reached out one hand, long bony fingers branching into spirals at the ends, and pointed toward the journal still sitting. On my table, write the final name. What name? You know it. I turned, walked toward the journal. My hand moved without me willing it. Opened the book to a blank page near the back, and I wrote, Eli Garrison. October 31st, I stopped, stared at the words, no. I whispered in my mind, not him, he helped me. The record is indifferent. There are no heroes, only witnesses, but he never hurt anyone. He remembered what should have stayed buried. Suddenly, I understood. Detective Garrison hadn't just investigated the cases. He had found a jar before me, maybe more than one, and he kept the truth from the world, hid the evidence. Let the pattern continue, and now he was part of the story. Write the final line. My fingers trembled. I dipped the pen again, and beneath Garrison's name, I wrote, the jar shatters, the story forgets. And then, silence, no voice in my head, no shadow behind me. Mr. Kind was gone, but not like a man leaves a room, like a thought being erased, like I had never remembered him to begin with. And yet the page was still warm, the ink was still wet. The next morning, I received a call. Eli Garrison was found dead in his kitchen. Massive cardiac event. No signs of trauma, but beneath his chair, carved into the floorboards, were 3 words: Jar 6 finalized. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in my living room as the sun came up. The journal on my lap, the ink drying on the final page. The pages are full now. There's nowhere left to write. But I don't need to, because I remember. Because I am the jar, and you, now that you've heard my story, so are you. After Detective Garrison's death, I felt like a ghost walking through my own life. The weight of the journal, the memories, the terrible knowledge pressed down on me like a shroud. But if I was going to be the last jar, the final keeper of these horrors, I had to keep going, to understand the full story, to find out how it all began. I started digging into local history, police archives, anything that could shed light on the other jars Mr. Kind had mentioned. That's when I found a case that stood out, buried deep in a stack of yellowed files labeled unsolved. It was from 1953, a boy, around 9 years old, found wandering near a railroad track outside Elk Bend. No teeth. Every single one missing, either pulled or broken. The official cause was severe malnutrition and neglect. But the medical examiner's notes mentioned something far stronger. Note about a ritualistic pattern etched into the inside of his mouth. A tiny symbol carved onto the gums. Impossible to see unless he was specifically looking. The boy was never identified. No family came forward. He was placed into foster care, but disappeared within months. No one heard from him again. His name was simply recorded as John Doe. I found one old newspaper clipping with a blurry photo, a pale, toothless kid with hollow eyes staring right through the camera. Underneath was a typed note: local boy found with disturbing signs of ritual abuse. Authorities baffled by the presence of an arcane symbol carved inside the mouth. Community fears growing. That symbol, I had seen it before. Not in the journal exactly, but scratched into the margins of one of the earliest entries, almost invisible beneath years of faded ink and crumpled pages. It was the same spiral, the leaf-ring pattern, the sign that Mr. Kind left wherever he moved. That meant the boy had been a jar too, one that had failed, one that had been erased. What happened to him? Where did he go? I searched foster records, court files, old hospital documents. Eventually, I stumbled on a second note, dated 2 years later, from a psychiatrist who'd briefly treated a young boy claiming to hear voices and see shadows that told him terrible things. Patient refuses to speak except in whispers, sometimes in unknown languages. Refers to himself as the jar and insists he carries memories no one else should know. The boy has no teeth and speaks of Mr. Kind visiting at night. His prognosis is poor. No further records existed. The trail went cold. The boy had vanished into the system, into oblivion. I closed the file slowly, feeling the weight of history pressing in. This wasn't just about me, or Detective Garrison, or the recent cases. This was a legacy, a line of children marked from birth, vessels forced to hold unspeakable horrors. The jars were the last witnesses, the last resistors against the forgetting, and the boy with no teeth was a warning that some jars didn't survive, that some memories were too heavy for any human to carry. I looked around my darkened living room and touched the journal's spine. If I was the final jar, then it was my responsibility to finish the story, no matter the cost. After uncovering the boy with no teeth and realizing the legacy stretched back decades, I thought maybe I had pieced together the worst of it. Maybe the story was nearing its end. But then the spiral returned. Not in my journal, not in a dream, but outside one evening. I was walking my dog along the edge of the woods behind my house. The same woods where that strange leaf spiral had appeared years ago. The air was crisp, early fall, the trees shedding their colors like old memories. The sky was bruised, purple, and everything felt heavy with quiet. Then, on the ground ahead, I saw it. The spiral dot, fresh, perfectly formed, leaves and twigs arranged in a clockwise swirl about 6 feet wide, just like the one from the journal's drawings. As I stepped closer, the hairs on my neck stood on end. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign. Someone or something was back. I reached down to touch the outer edge. The leaves were cold. Too cold for a warm autumn evening, and then I heard it, a whispered soft, so faint I almost thought it was the wind. Remember, the voice was distant, like it was coming from underground. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. I looked around, no one there, just the spiral, waiting. I thought of Mr. Kind, the jars, the stories I'd buried deep inside my mind, and I realized with a chill that the cycle wasn't broken. It was restarting. The spiral was a calling card, an invitation, and maybe a warning. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my window. No breeze, no animals nearby, just the rhythmic scrape of nails or something like nails dragging slowly against glass. I didn't look. I didn't want to. But the whisper followed me back into my dreams. You are the jar, and the jar must open again. I don't know how many jars there were before me. I don't know how many names are left to write. But the spiral has returned, and that means the story is far from over. The spiral's return was a message, not just to me, but to whoever was still watching. To whoever were whatever still needed the jars to remember. I dove back into the journal with a renewed urgency. Every entry, every name, every date, suddenly, felt like a countdown. The faces of those missing, those lost, became more than just stories. They were people, real people. I began cross-referencing the names in my journal with missing persons reports, cold cases, and unsolved murders from across the region. What I found was staggering dot names that matched, sometimes spelled differently but unmistakable. Dates that lined up perfectly sometimes. Even after my entries were written, places described with unnerving accuracy. Some victims were never found. Others discovered long after the fact. Sometimes in conditions eerily similar to the journal's descriptions. Hands bent back, leaves in mouths, spiral markings near bodies. The list was growing. The more I uncovered, the heavier the weight. On my chest, I realized these weren't isolated incidents. The journal wasn't just a notebook of dark imagination. It was a ledger of evil, written by a child who was never just a child. Each name was a story, a fragment of horror the world had forgotten or refused to remember. But the jars remembered, and now, so did I. Every night, new names whispered to me in dreams, their voices fragile yet desperate. Remember me, tell our stories, don't forget. The line between dream and reality blurred. I found myself haunted, not just by Mr. Kind, but by the faces behind those names. Pleading, accusing, waiting. I reached out to local cold case investigators, sharing the names and dates. Some were skeptical, others wary. A few promised to look deeper, but the truth was, the more I shared, the more I felt the eyes on me, watching, waiting. Because the jars weren't just recorders, they were the last line before forgetting consumed everything. And if I stopped remembering, if I failed, the spiral would close, and everything would be lost. The more I tried to live normally, the more the weight of the journal pressed down on me, not just mentally, but physically. It was as if the memories I carried weren't just in my mind, but etched into my very body. It started with headaches deep, relentless, like a vice tightening around my skull. Sometimes, when the pain peaked, I'd see flickers at the edges of my vision, shadows curling in impossible ways, like whispers made manifest. I knew they were watching. Waiting. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares returned with a vengeance, filled with faces some I recognized, others blurred beyond recognition, trapped in endless loops of terror and silence. Mr. Kind's presence was a constant, a dark pulse behind every dream, reminding me I was never truly alone. During the day, I began hearing whispers, soft and almost inaudible when I was alone. Sometimes in crowded rooms, the voice was never clear, but always urgent, commanding me to remember, to write, to keep the record alive. I started carrying the journal everywhere, scribbling down every fleeting image, phrase, or sensation before it slipped away. My hands sometimes trembled uncontrollably. At other times, they felt numb, disconnected, as if the memories inside me were draining my very life force. Friends noticed my change, but I couldn't explain the truth. Who would believe that I was a vessel for something ancient and horrific? Strangers began watching me too. I caught glimpses of shadowy figures in mirrors or at the edge of my vision, vanishing when I looked directly. One afternoon, I found a small spiral etched into my apartment doorframe, freshly carved. The wood, raw and splintered. Panic began to take root. The warning signs were everywhere. Mr. Kind was closing in. I knew November 1st, the date written in the journal, was fast approaching. The final chapter was near, and I was running out of time. November 1st arrived like a slow, suffocating fog. I didn't sleep the night before. The journal lay open on my desk, its pages yellowed and worn, but that last blank entry glaring back at me like a challenge. Every whisper, every shadow, every pulse of dread crescendoed into a silent scream inside my mind. I sat there, pen in hand, trembling. The room felt impossibly cold, the air thick and stale. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, shaking loose dead leaves in a like the one that had haunted me for months. My hands moved on their own. I wrote the final words. Slowly, deliberately, the ink bled into the paper, I remember. I am the jar. The story ends here. As the last word dried, a suffocating stillness fell over the room. The shadows gathered, thick and black, curling from every corner, and then I heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a silence so deep, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Mr. Kind stepped forward from the darkness, tall, faceless and terrible. But this time, there was no fear, no pleading, only understanding. He reached out not to harm, but to absorb, to carry me, the last jar, into the forgetting. And as the darkness closed around me, I understood. The jars exist, so that memories live on, even if the bodies fail, even if the names are lost, because as long as one remembers, the story never truly ends. The days after November 1st felt unreal, like I was drifting between worlds. I don't know if I truly left the story, or if I became part of it, etched forever into the margins of the world's forgotten horrors. The journal is closed now, the pages full, the last entry written in trembling ink. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, I feel the presence of the jars who came before me. Their memories ripple beneath my skin like a cold tide. They remind me that memory is a fragile thing, a weapon, a curse. To forget is to vanish, to remember is to survive. And though my story has ended on the last page, the story itself continues, in the spirals left behind in the woods, in the whispers carried on the wind, in every lost name waiting to be found. If you've listened this far, if you feel a chill reading these words, you might be ajar to dot maybe. The story is not finished. Maybe it's only just beginning, because as long as someone remembers, nothing is ever truly gone.